Thank you, Chandra. Good morning, everyone. It's a delight to be here. Farewell, grade 4, 5s, junior high. We will miss you. For those of you remaining with us, I have a question to get us started. What are you afraid of? Fear. It is such a powerful emotion that we can all relate with. Everyone is afraid of something. It's okay to admit. Fear, I know it's also represented in art, especially in film. There are so many classic movie scenes that center around this kind of underlying reality of fear. Some of the movies that I thought of as I was prepping this week that involve this kind of sort of sub-theme of fear are Good Will Hunting, Coach Carter, Dune. Of course, you can't tell fear without talking about Ghostbusters. I'm afraid of no ghost. And then my favorite scene, Rocky. I'm afraid. It's good. If you don't know the moment, watch it later. It's good. We asked our pastors, what are you afraid of? And I'm curious if you can guess what they are afraid of. So you can see our pastors there, Aiden, Chandra, myself, Dallin, Darlene, Kim, Paul, and Scotty. And you're going to play a little game. And here are your options. Can you match the right pastor with the right fear? Go ahead, talk about it with a few people next to you. See if you can sort it out. A few obvious ones for some of us who know people. Do you have an idea? Any guesses? There's a few creepy ones up there. So that, clowns, heights, snakes, bears, tight spaces, rats, mice, and being buried alive. Ooh. Okay, you ready for the answers? All right, here's how it goes. Aiden is scared of rats. Chandra, everybody knows, is scared of clowns. I assumed this was because Chandra grew up as a carny kid, but it's actually because her house had lots of clown figurines. That was a fun fact. I am afraid of tight spaces. Dallin's afraid of heights, which I think is reasonable. I'm also pretty afraid of heights. Darlene is afraid of bears, but especially, she said, bears attacking her tent while she's camping. So very specific fear. Kim's afraid of snakes. Paul, afraid of being buried alive. I feel like there's something to probably explore there. I don't know what that's about, but... And then, poor Scotty, afraid of mice. Isn't that just precious? I love that one. Well, as you can imagine, the theme of fear is going to be a part of this week's installment in our teaching series on the book of Judges, which we have entitled, You Do You. And over the past few weeks, Pastor Paul has guided us through this complex book that's found in the Old Testament in the Bible. And depending on your experience with the Bible, or your expectations probably of the Bible, the book of Judges might mess with our categories a little bit. Because, when we think of the Bible, we hear things like the Bible it's the Word of God. It's God's message to us. And that kind of comes with expectations for what that's going to look like, what it's going to feel like. Like sage words of wisdom, guidance, some commands and direction, probably some sense of inspiration. And you will find that throughout most of the Bible, but not so much in Judges. This book retells the journey of the people of Israel through a very dark season. A season that was largely marked by disobedience, unfaithfulness to God, violence, and tragedy. And as Paul has talked about over the past few weeks, there's a very clear pattern that happens throughout the book of Judges. And as the book unfolds, this develops as like a downward spiral of greater and greater dysfunction. The pattern is simple. Israel turns away from God in disobedience, and there are consequences that follow. And then the people cry out to God for relief, and God raises up a judge to rescue them. And then there's peace for a while, but then the cycle repeats itself, and the people wander from God and return to their disobedient ways. And as we look at today's passage, you will recognize this same pattern is at work. Today, we're going to be looking at Judges chapter 6 to 8. And chapter 5 concludes by saying that the people enjoyed 40 years of peace. But those 40 years were followed by, as you can expect, the pattern repeating itself. Israel did evil in the eyes of the Lord, it says, and the Midianites started to dominate the people. So Midian, as you can see, is kind of down in the southeast, and up in Canaan is sort of where most of the events happen in the book of Judges. Now, a quick Bible nerd moment for anybody in the crowd. Does anybody remember Midian appearing in the story of the Bible in any other situations? Oh, Moses. Well done. Exactly. Midian is where Moses fled when he was kind of like fleeing away from the kind of things that had happened in Egypt. Moses was in Midian when the Lord called out to him from the famous burning bush scene. And so the Midianites, they have made their way into the region, and they have displaced the Israelites, the passage says. They've been pushed to the kind of edges, and they fled for shelter in the mountain clefts and caves. And in desperation, the Israelites cry out to the Lord for help. When the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet who said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians, and I delivered you from the hand of all your oppressors. I drove them out before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you live. But you have not listened to me." God responds to their cries by pointing back to the story of the Exodus, the story that was a foundational marker for Israel's identity. And the emphasis on the Exodus, it's not random. This is the central theme of the Hebrew Bible. And it is an important theme that the book of Judges wants us to have on our minds. And if you're not familiar with the Exodus story, here's a kind of a quick summary. So the Israelites, they went to Egypt originally to seek refuge because there was a famine in their land. And Joseph was one of their own, and he had risen to a place of power in Egypt and earned favor with the Pharaoh. But eventually, the Egyptians' opinions of the Israelites shifted, and they started to oppress them. And so for many years, they were held as captive slaves in Egypt until God performed a miraculous rescue mission and delivered the people from Egypt and into the promised land of Canaan. And the Exodus journey, it introduces a very important theme that is going to be weaved throughout the rest of the Bible. And you can kind of summarize this Exodus motif into three simple questions. What is holding us captive? How can we be rescued? And what is the promised rest? And you can make a pretty good argument that the Exodus motif is essentially the main theme of all the scriptures, but most definitely the main theme of the Old Testament. And the author of Judges wants us to have this Exodus motif in mind. And Judges keeps emphasizing that the rescue that Israel truly needs, it isn't just safety from their surrounding enemies. There's something within them that needs to be addressed. So, with these three big questions hovering over Israel as they endure the oppression of the Midianites, the angel of the Lord appears to a man named Gideon. Angel of the Lord. Bible nerds activated again. Where have we encountered this character before? Yes, it was the angel of the Lord who appeared to Moses in that burning bush scene back in Midian. So this is another echo of the Exodus. And the angel of the Lord came to Gideon while he was threshing grain in a winepress because he was hiding from the Midianites. Now, I don't know about you, I've never threshed grain or hung out in a wine press for that matter. But apparently this is like not the right place for this task. Ideally, you want to thresh grain out in the open, I guess, so the chaff can kind of like blow away, or experts have told me this. But a wine press, it's like a tight, contained space. So this is like an awkward place for the job. This would be like if you found somebody chopping wood in your kitchen. It's like, I guess it works, but it's not the right way to do it. But understandably, Gideon is afraid. Despite Gideon's fear, though, the angel of the Lord immediately comes in and he kind of starts pumping his tires. He declares, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." And that's like the energy we need in those moments, right? Like the angel doesn't chastise Gideon for hiding out. Instead, he speaks a word of assurance that God is with him. And he speaks a word of confidence into Gideon's identity. You're not a coward. You are a mighty warrior. But Gideon, he's not buying it. The Lord is with us? If that's true, then why has all this devastation happened? Where is the wonder-working power of God that rescued our ancestors from Egypt? No, I don't buy it. You see, he thinks God has abandoned Israel rather than recognizing that Israel has abandoned God. And see, Gideon, he's lost track of God's big story. It doesn't occur to Gideon that he and his people are actually part of the problem, and they actually have the potential to be part of the solution. But God doesn't wield this against them. He just reassures Gideon, "I am the one who's sending you." But Gideon, he remains reluctant, so he insists on a sign. And so God agrees to this arrangement, and Gideon goes away, and he prepares a little picnic offering, a little bread, a little stew, and he puts it before the angel of the Lord. And the angel of the Lord lights it up in a total blaze, consuming everything. And it's at this moment that Gideon starts to freak out a little bit, realizing whoa, this really is the Lord that I'm encountering, and he becomes very afraid. But the Lord said to him, "Peace, do not be afraid." And so it says that Gideon built an altar to the Lord there and called it, "The Lord is Peace." And to this day it stands. See, eventually Gideon recognizes the presence of God with him, and he prepares this altar. The Lord is Shalom. See, in the midst of the surrounding chaos, Gideon makes this concrete declaration that the Lord is peace. And this altar, it will become a communal marker of God's identity, God's mission, God's gift to the people. And the text, it says that still to this day, this altar stands as a reminder to all the people that the Lord is indeed peace. Throughout all the dark seasons, this altar would serve as a reminder of truth that stands above whatever difficult situations the people were facing. And when you and I, when we have an encounter with God, I think there's often an expectation that life will never be the same, right? God is with us, so the journey ahead should be increasingly joyful or peaceful or blessed. But life doesn't often play out that way. There are detours, obstacles, missteps. And I don't know where you're at currently in your stage or season of life. Maybe you are currently in a season where you do feel close to God, where you're finding a sense of strength from God's presence. You're experiencing a sense of peace or joy or comfort. I wonder, are there ways that we can, in a similar way, kind of establish an altar that can serve as a reminder of God's presence for maybe the seasons that are going to be ahead, that are going to be a little bit more difficult than where we find ourselves right now? And I don't know, for me, the idea of an altar, it's a little weird, a little foreign. I like the image of a climbing anchor. You know how this works, right? As climbers make their way up the mountain, they sink these anchors along their route, so that if they get in trouble up ahead, the anchor will hold them secure if they happen to fall. So are there anchors that we can establish along our own journey of faith? Something visible that we can place in our lives that serves as a physical reminder of who God is and what we know to be true, that we're going to need at some future time. This is why some of us have tattoos or put scripture on our wall or keep mementos that are important to us that we put on shelves in our rooms, things that can serve as physical, visible reminders of God's presence with us throughout our journey. Maybe you need to consider a fresh way of putting down some kind of altar that can anchor you and serve as a reminder of God's faithfulness so that you and your people can look to that and remember God no matter what is going to come your way in the seasons ahead. Now, Gideon, it seems like he's going to need this reassurance of God's presence pretty quick because as the story unfolds, the first thing that God asks him to do is to take down some idols in the community that are dedicated to other gods. And the Lord wants Gideon to start with the idol at his dad's house. No easing into things, right? Just like, we couldn't pick the guy on the edge of town with the bad BO that nobody likes to hang out with. Like, no. We're going to go straight to daddy's idols and take care of those. And this has max potential to cause friction. This poses a huge risk for Gideon, but he goes ahead and he does it. It says, so Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him. But because he was afraid of his family and the townspeople, he did it at night rather than the daytime. He's afraid, but he does it. And in the morning, the whole community is ticked. But his dad actually stands up for him. He says, well, if Baal, the person that this idol was dedicated to, is really a powerful God, Baal can step up and deal with this. Okay, got through that situation. The idols have been addressed, but what about those Midianites? Well, Gideon senses it's time to deal with these surrounding enemies, but he just needs a little more assurance that God is actually with him. He just keeps doubting. And he asks God for another test. He takes a fleece and he says to God, in the morning, if the fleece is wet and the ground around it's dry, I will know. This is it. I will know you will save Israel as you promised. So he wakes up and he finds the fleece just as he asked. But then Gideon's still a little unsure, and he's just asking, just one more. I promised last one, just the inverse. This time I want fleece, dry, ground, wet. We're good? Last one, I promise. And so, God, for some reason, just keeps doing these things. And once again, God meets the request. Gideon wakes up, and he finds the dry fleece on the wet ground. And so finally, it seems like Gideon is maybe ready to trust God. So he rounds up an army, and he's prepared for battle. But then God steps in. He's like, whoa. You have way too many men, too many soldiers. Because God wants to make sure that everyone knows that this is not a human battle that's unfolding, that it is going to be the Lord who defeats the Midianites. So you got to trim down your crew, Gideon. And so at this point, Gideon had 32,000 men, which you're like, oh, okay, yeah, that's a big army, I guess. But until you learn that the Midianites have roughly 135,000 men. So I don't know. 32,000 versus 135,000 already feels lopsided to me, but this is God, so we're good. So God says, tell your men, if any of you are afraid, feel free to go home. So 35,000, 135,000, yeah, okay. 22,000 are we're just gonna go home if that's okay. So now Gideon's left with 10,000 men. But God is yeah, that's still too many. And so here's what we're going to do. Take your men down to the water and then observe how they drink. And keep all the men who use their hands to kind of cup the water to their mouth, but send home all the guys who bend over to lap up the water like a dog. And honestly, I'm kind of down with this logic. Can you imagine? You're supposed to be headed to battle, and somebody beside your crew is just sinking their face in the water, trying to lap up with their tongue like a dog. I'm no, send this guy home. Well, it turns out only 300 of the men drank the water like a normal person. So now Gideon's crew has gone from 32,000 to 300. And so not surprisingly, Gideon is still afraid, but he keeps taking steps of obedience. Eventually, the 300 men have a showdown with the Midianites, and God ultimately displays his power and might. And it's going to be clear to everyone in the land that it was the Lord who delivered Gideon and his men from the hands of the Midianite army. So God delivers Israel. The Midianites are defeated, and peace is restored in the land for 40 years. Gideon, a heroic tale of a timid leader who finds his courage. Hopefully by now, you're not surprised to learn that things are not so neat and tidy. Yeah, Gideon did show this movement from fear to trust, but he's far from a faith hero that we ought to follow after. After the battle with the Midianites, you read on, and Gideon, he kind of develops this very aggressive edge, and he starts getting into all these fights over what seems to be honor, and he's shedding blood with cold ruthlessness, even among his own people. And there's this casual mention of oh yeah, and Gideon had 70 children because he had many wives. You're oh, that's uncomfortable. And additionally, he takes the gold from his plunders and then he puts together some other kind of altar thing. The scriptures aren't totally clear, but what is clear is what he builds becomes a new place of idol worship for the people. It's a full circle journey for Gideon, from tearing down idols to erecting a new one. And the cycle of disobedience of Judges continues on. And throughout this series, Paul has reminded us that often the Bible, it acts like a mirror. It exposes things that we need to see in ourselves. And so while Judges doesn't offer a lot of sage words of wisdom or guidance or inspiration, there's value in examining these stories and allowing God's Spirit to speak to us through them. And I think there are important questions for all of us to sit with from this story. First off, what are you afraid of? Let's be real. There are many heavy things happening around the world and close to home that are legitimately scary. It's easy for us to kind of scoff at Gideon, but if you look at what he was facing, being afraid is reasonable. And there are things that we are up against that it's natural for fear to be a thing that we experience. There are things happening around the world that are frightening. And things happening nearby or in our own lives, right? Political and economic uncertainty. Many of us or our family members or friends are navigating health concerns. Where some of us are facing very complex, difficult relationship dynamics that feel like they're very loaded and they can have huge implications on what our life looks like. And whatever it might be, we all know what it means to be afraid. And like Gideon, sometimes we might lose track of God's story amidst all that's happening around us. And in the same way that the angel of the Lord came and spoke a word of clarity to Gideon, I believe God wants us to find courage of remembering God's story, of knowing confidently that no matter what we are facing, that the Lord is with you. What we need is we need to anchor our lives to that story. We need to let words like Hebrews 13 sink deep into our hearts, which is God has said, I will never fail you. I will never abandon you. So we can say with confidence, the Lord is my helper, so I will have no fear. We anchor ourselves to the story. And we remind ourselves that despite what's right in front of us, or despite what's going on in the world that makes us fearful, there's something bigger, overarching, that we can anchor ourselves into and that we can lean into and we can draw hope from. And now, keeping in mind that Exodus motif that is weaved through Judges and through all of Scriptures, I think it's also important for us to consider what is holding us captive. What are the idols in our time? We live in such a different world, right? We read these stories from Judges, and it's so different. It's so foreign to us. Our world is not saturated with the idea that power and safety come from spiritual powers that are represented by idols among us. But our world has other things that have us confused and distracted from God. Our world is saturated by the idea that power and safety come from the economy or from political control or from securing our own little kingdom of safety and comfort with boundaries like my home that keep me buffered from the world, or my possessions, that they're the things that keep my life stable. And the Lord was adamant that the idols in Gideon's world needed to come down because they were a distraction that pulled the devotion of the people away from God. And spotting the idols in our world is not always easy. But we need to ask ourselves these hard questions. What distractions are pulling me and my people away from being fully devoted to God? And this is going to be our task this week in home church, because we need to discern this together. We need to have the courage to open ourselves up to hard questions, because again, the Israelites were totally lulled into a way consistently. And if we think that we are different, we are fooling ourselves. We are lulled into things without even realizing. And those idols seep into our worlds, and we justify them, we excuse them, we just assume this is a normal part of how the world works. And God is regularly trying to wake us up to say, no, there are things that are holding you captive. You need to see them. You need to name them. And together as a community, we need to ask ourselves, what does it mean to rid ourselves of those idols, to tear those things down? And you know what? This is a spiritual work. We may not think of the world in the same kind of spiritual way that the Israelites did of idols, but the New Testament is very clear. The Apostle Paul is convinced that there are spiritual powers constantly at work in the ways of our world. And this is exactly what Jesus came to rescue us from. In Romans, Paul says this: we know that our old sinful selves were crucified with Christ so that sin might lose its power in our lives. We're no longer slaves to sin. For when we died with Christ, we were set free from the powers of sin. Do not let sin control the way you live. Do not give in to sinful desires. Do not let any part of your body become an instrument of evil to serve sin. Instead, give yourselves completely to God. For you were dead, but now you have new life. So use your whole body as an instrument to do what is right for the glory of God. We have the ultimate hope that sin has lost its power over our lives. The way of rescue out of captivity, it has been secured when Christ died on the cross. We have been set free. So now we must avoid letting sin control us anymore. The scriptures are trying to warn us not to repeat the cycle. Do not let any part of your body become an instrument to serve sin. Instead, give yourselves completely to God. For we were dead, but now we've got new life. So use your whole body as an instrument to do what is right for the glory of God. This is the rescue that God offers us. This is the life that we are learning to embrace together. We need not fear because God is with us. And Jesus gave his life so that we can truly live in freedom. And now we can stand strong in the love of God together.